He hadn't eaten in 2 days. She hadn't cried in 3. The sheriff wanted justice. The town wanted entertainment. But the rancher, he just saw a boy who wouldn't stop reaching for hope, even with shackles on. The auction block stood crooked on the back of a flatbed cart, splintered with stain with dust and pride. Half of Grayson's population gathered that morning in the square, jaws tight, eyes hungrier than they had any right to be. Some came to mock. Some came to spit. Some came with coins, hoping to leave with a lesson. Standing tall on the platform, the sheriff held resting on his belt, chin high like a man who thought himself judge, jury, and shepherd of righteousness. But it wasn't a man standing beside him. It was a boy, 9, maybe 10, barefoot, ribs visible through a ripped cotton shirt, sweat clumped on the brown hair, dirt smeared across his cheeks like bruises he never had the chance to wash off. Rusted iron cuffs bound his wrists, which were inappropriate for a child. But what stopped everyone, what made the murmurs hush for a single breath, wasn't his appearance. It was a package that he wrapped in a feed bag that had been ripped and clutched close to his chest. A baby. She couldn't have been more than a few months old, her head covered in soft, dark curls, eyes closed against the wind, too tired, or too weak to complain. Her little arm dangled free, limp. Name's Tommy. The sheriff raised his voice without confirming its veracity. Caught stealing from Mrs. Dolly's pantry last night. Half a loaf of bread, slice of salted ham, and an onion. Laughter rippled from the crowd. A boy. Tommy didn't give a second thought, even though stealing an onion seemed funny. He only tightened his grip on the baby, angling his body to shield her from the wind. It was for his sister. The sheriff continued, spitting off the side of the wagon. We'll see if that holds up. Either way, we don't tolerate thievery in Grayson. Town council agreed. Boys old enough to be punished, as a man would. Punished. They referred to it as such. Now there'd been no trial, no questions, just a crowd and a hammer. And a rule that said orphans didn't count for much. They couldn't jail him, too. Young. Couldn't hang him, not without backlash from the circuit judge. But there was one thing the town loved as much as order spectacle. So the sheriff took bids. Auction starts at $1. He called. $1 buys his debt. You take him home, feed him, work him till he's paid. What he owes. Girl comes with. Tommy was silent. His face was stiff with defiance, but his knees shook beneath him. He squeezed the infant closer. From the crowd, a merchant raised his hand. $2, he said, smirking. Looks like he can. Carry a sack of beans. $3, said another man. I'll put him in the barn. With the goats. $5, $6. Each voice stacked heavier on. The boy's shoulders. Like a barking dog pushing whiskey, the sheriff called out the numbers. 7. Do I hear 8? A clear voice then came from the square's edge. Through the noise. 10. The bidding stopped, heads turned. The sheriff lowered the gavel, scanning for source. No one had seen him arrive. He wasn't from town. That much was certain. He sat atop a pale buckskin horse, coat draped in dust, hat low over his brow. His beard was touched with gray, though his shoulders held strong like a man who hadn't learned how to quit. A rifle was strapped to the saddle, but, untouched, the boy was the sole focus of his attention. I said 10, he repeated louder. This time, name! The sheriff barked. Marshal Rigg. He dismounted slowly, boots heavy on the packed dirt. Someone in the crowd whispered, Rigg from South. Ridge. AI that the one what? Hush came the answer. Marshal walked forward. Each step measured. His gaze never left the child. Not the baby. The boy. 10s. The highest bid, according to the sheriff. Unless someone wants 11. Sold, Marshal said before the hammer fell. The sheriff hesitated. You don't want to hear the rest. Boy's a thief. Girl's sick, likely more trouble than they're worth. Marshal nodded once. I'll immediately fit in. Laughter rose again, but quieter now. The sheriff's lips curled into something sour. Still, a deal was a deal. He reached down to unshackle the boy, tossing the keys to Marshall. Tommy didn't move. Marshall stepped close, crouched low, and unlocked the irons himself. The boy flinched as the cuffs dropped, but he didn't run, ceased speaking, just looked up with hollow eyes. Marshall turned around. "You got a name?" "Son." She and Tommy Ruthie. Marshall studied the baby. Her lips were chapped, eyes sunk deep. She stirred just slightly as he adjusted the feed sack, checking for warmth. "She needs milk," he said. "And sleep." I tried. Tommy searched for some while murmuring. Marshall got up and extended a hand. Tommy looked at it like it was a snake, but then slowly he reached out and took it. The square began to empty. Some folks shook their heads. Some muttered about fools and their charity, but none stopped him as Marshall led the boy and his sister toward the edge of town, where a wagon waited tethered to a mule. Tommy climbed in, clutching Ruthie tight. Marshall handed him a wool blanket. He advised wrapping her nicely. "We've got a ride." "Ahead." "Where we going?" Tommy asked, voice barely a whisper. "Home," Marshall said. Simply, they rode through the hills without much talk. Tommy sat in the back, eyes darting to every branch and rock like the world might lunge him again. Ruthie slept. Once she coughed, and Tommy panicked, lifting her upright, patting her back. Marshall returned with her when a portion of the water spilled onto Tommy's lap. The canteen remained silent. By nightfall, the sky had turned dark as slate, stars hidden behind thick clouds. They stopped at a ridge where a lone cabin sat tucked beneath the pines. The place wasn't big, but it was sturdy. Smoke curled from the chimney. Marshall didn't ask. He just lifted Ruthie into his arms and carried her inside. Tommy followed close, hands twitching like he didn't know whether to fight or flee. Inside, the warmth hit fast. A fire crackled. The floor was swept. A placemat stood in the center with 2 chairs. Neither used much. Marshall set Ruthie in a cradle. It creaked gently beneath her weight. He ladled soup from a pot, poured it into 2 bowls, and set them on the table. Tommy looked at the food as though it vanished. "Eat," Marshall said. "It is not poison." Tommy obeyed, spoon trembling in his fingers. He didn't look up until the bowl was nearly empty. "He's sick. She's ill," said finally. "Since the storm, I've been coughing." Marshall, "I'll bring a doctor home," said. "Come dawn." Tommy's lip quivered. They didn't want her. Said she was just dead. "Wait." Marshall didn't move his eyes. "Then it's good I'm not them." That. Tommy didn't get much sleep at night. He sat by the cradle and observed Ruthie's chest expand and contract. Each time she exhales caught, he stiffened. Every time she stirred, he whispered to her. Marshall watched from the doorway. He remembered the sound of a child's cough, remembered the silence that followed. Years back, he'd buried Hope beside a grave marked by a small wooden cross, and hadn't spoken of it since. Now, watching Tommy, something act again. The boy had that look, the look of someone who'd run out of road, but kept walking anyway. The look of someone who understood what it meant to be forgotten. Marshall stepped back into the hall, pulled a faded quilt from the shelf, and laid it gently over Tommy's shoulders. By morning, the girl was worse. She wheezed softly, skin pale, lips blue. Marshall hitched the mule and rode into town by itself. He came back an hour later with 2 small glass bottles and a doctor. The doctor didn't ask questions. He'd seen Marshall once before years back, when a different child had become ill. He now worked quickly. "Keep her warm," he told Marshall. "Just a drop every hour. If she makes it through the night, she'll likely pull through." Tommy didn't ask her what would happen if didn't. The wind had once more picked up by sunset. Clouds rolled low. Inside, the fire roared. Tommy sat by Ruthie's side, counting seconds between her breaths. Marshall carved wood quietly and steadily in the corner. "You ain't going to send us back?" Tommy asked suddenly. Marshall paused, knife still in hand. His voice cracked. "No, even if she... In any case." The night dragged slow as molasses, but it wasn't sleep that. blanketed the cabin. It was silence, heavy waiting, the kind of hush that comes before the world decides whether to keep spinning or stop altogether. Ruthie wheezed while she slept, her chest rising and falling too slowly and shallowly. Alongside her, Tommy sat rigidly with a hunched back and dry eyes. He hadn't cried, not once, but the set of his jaw, the way his small fists clenched into the wool blanket, they spoke louder than tears. Ever could. Marshall sat at the edge of the hearth, legs stretched toward the fire, one boot, tapping slow against the floor. He didn't look at the boy, didn't say much, but every so often he glanced toward the cradle, checking for breath. Tommy drew closer and held his breath as Ruthie gave off a faint cough and a tiny twitch. Breath until hers resumed. Then he'd whisper something low, something Marshall couldn't hear, but understood. All the same, a plea of promise. The sound of a boy who had nothing left but a sister and refused to let go. By midnight, the wind had turned sharp, scrubbing the windows with branches like claws. The fire popped and spat embers, casting brief shadows across the wooden walls. Tommy still hadn't moved. Marshall rose quietly across the room and laid a second quilt across the boy's shoulders. Tommy didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge it. His eyes were fixed on Ruthie, and his entire body begged her to continue breathing. Marshall stood there a moment longer, then moved back to his chair. He reached for his carving knife again, drawing a thin block of cedar from the basket at his feet. His hands moved slow, methodical, shaving away layers of wood. He wasn't sure what he was carving yet. Maybe a bird, maybe a horse, something small, something solid, something that could fit into a child's palm and not fall apart. Ruthie was wheezing by dawn, had become softer, though not completely gone. Her lips no longer looked blue. Her forefingers wriggled while asleep. Tommy finally let out a breath that didn't shake. He didn't smile. He was too scared to, but something in his face softened just a little. Marshall brewed coffee in the old percolator, whose has filled the cabin with warm aromas. He filled a chipped cup and poured himself a mug with warm milk and brought it to Tommy. Marshall said, "She'll wake up soon." Tommy blinked as if the words startled him. He took the cup with both hands, still careful not to jostle the cradle. "Thank you," he murmured, voice rough from two. Many nights of silence. Marshall just nodded. They ate oatmeal that morning, plain but hot. Tommy ate slowly, occasionally turning his gaze to Ruthie. When she finally stirred, letting out a soft moan and blinking heavy eyes, Tommy nearly dropped the spoon. He charged at her, repeatedly muttering her name, kissing her tiny forehead with trembling lips. Marshall observed, his face expression unreadable. "She's okay," Tommy whispered as if saying out loud might break the spell. "She's really okay." Marshall didn't say she wasn't out of danger yet. He just reached across the table and passed the boy a clean cloth. The days, the subsequent events settled into rhythm. Mornings were cold, but bright. Marshall rose early, fed the mule, chopped wood, and came inside with arms full of pine. Tommy helped where he could, fetching water from the pump, feeding chickens. That clucked louder than a Sunday sermon. He watched Marshall like a hawk, mimicking how he held tools, how he moved quiet through the brush, how he tied knots and checked traps. But Ruthie, she stayed inside. She had improved. Not well, but better. She ate more, cried less, even smiled once when Marshall made a face behind Tommy's back. Her cough was brief, but her color had returned. Cheeks. Marshall sanded old cherry wood smooth to make a cradle for her, carving tiny stars into the headboard. Tommy helped him polish it, working his raw fingers until they sparkled like fire. Each evening, Marshall cooked, while Tommy read from the only book he knew, an old, tattered Bible missing half its cover and 3 pages from. Psalms. He didn't read well, stumbling over big words, but Marshall never corrected him. He just listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes staring, into the flames like he was chasing uncontrollable thoughts. One night, as Tommy closed the book and tucked it beneath his cot, He turned to Marshall. "Do you think God forgot about us?" Marshall did not immediately respond. He put down his coffee and leaned back in the chair with his fingers crossed. "No," he said finally, "but I think he lets us find each other sometimes, even when it's hard." Tommy nodded slowly, like he was unsure whether he could, but he wanted to believe it. Then he crawled under the blanket and slept hard for the first time without waking. Word traveled fast in a town like Grayson. At the conclusion of the week, people knew where the boy had gone, knew who took him in, knew the girl was still breathing. Some scoffed, said it was a fool's errand. Others watched the ridge with weary eyes, wondering if Marshall, Rig, had finally cracked after all these years. However, one man did more than just marvel. His name was Cord Alton, and he had a badge now. He hadn't earned it, just inherited it when the last deputy got drunk and rode into a ravine. Cord was, mean in a quiet way, the kind of man who remembered slights, counted debts, and hated being ignored. He'd bid on the boy, too, had plans to use him for labor, maybe sell him again down the line. It wasn't about the child, it was about pride, and Marshall Rig had outbid him. Cord didn't forget things like that. He rode up to the cabin one afternoon, without warning, no letter, no notice, just dust on his boots and spite in his veins. Marshall saw him coming from the ridge without bothering to conceal his frown. He stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed. "You lost?" Marshall asked. Cord dismounted, dusting off his coat like he owned the place. "Just doing my rounds," he said, checking up on the boy, making sure you're not harboring a pair of runaways. "They ain't runaways," Marshall said flatly. "Town sold them to me." "Sure did, but that don't mean they stay yours. Council's been talking. Some people think you shouldn't be raising a child, let alone two." Marshall did not move a muscle. "I'm not raising them. I'm giving them a roof." Cord's lip curled. "You think that's enough? Better than what you'd give." That landed. Cord stepped closer, boots creaking against the porch boards. "You got no wife, no kin, no claim to that boy or the girl. Ain't natural." Tommy stood just inside the doorway, holding Ruthie tight. Marshall didn't raise his voice. He just stepped between Cord and the door. "I didn't ask for your opinion." "Well, you're going to get it anyway." Cord snapped. "If you want to keep Em here, fine, but don't cry when they leave. Might be the sheriff's word now, but the council's got longer arms than you think." Marshall stared hard. "Then they can ride up here themselves." Cord held his stare another second, then spit into the dirt and mounted his horse. He advised, "Suit yourself. However, winter is coming and I have no hope." Keeps a child warm. He rode away, but the stirred-up dust did not settle. That night, Marshall packed extra wood inside. He checked the locks twice, sat longer by the fire than usual. Tommy sensed something was wrong, but didn't ask. "Do they intend to take us?" He whispered after Ruthie had fallen. Asleep, Marshall shook his head, not without a fight. Tommy was hesitant. Then he asked the question he'd been holding since day one. "Why'd you take us?" Marshall stared into the flames. "I was alone," he said finally, "and I figured. Maybe that wasn't how it had to stay." That year, early snowfall occurred. Thick wet flakes that clung to everything and turned the path to town into a ghost trail. Marshall kept the fire going day and night. He taught Tommy how to chop kindling, how to split logs without losing fingers, how to listen to wind and know when trouble was coming. But trouble didn't wait for wind. It came one night fast and loud. 3 riders, no torches, just hooves and fists and the sound of wood splintering. The door cracked open with a scream of nails. Tommy woke with a start, clutching Ruthie. Marshall was already up, rifle in hand. Cord was first through the door. He just barked, not smiling. "By order of the council, we're taking the children." Marshall didn't move. "You got papers? Got something better?" Cord growled. "Authority." 2 more men stepped inside, hands on, pistols. Tommy backed into the corner, Ruthie wailing now. Marshall's voice. "Drop cold sharp. You take one more step. I swear before God, you'll regret it. Cord sneered. You're gonna shoot us in front of the boy. If I have to. The standoff pulsed with heat. The silence was broken by Ruthie's screams. Then one of the men stepped forward. That's when Marshall fired. The shot cracked like thunder, not a man at the beam above their heads. Splinters erupted. Dust choked the air. The writers ducked, cursed, stumbled back through the door. Next one won't miss. Marshall warned. Cord glared, teeth bared. This is not finished. No, Marshall said, stepping forward. It's just beginning. The night bled quiet once the hooves vanished into the trees. Marshall stood in the wreckage of the doorway, jaw tight, breath fogging in the cold. Outside, snow drifted gently through the light from the shattered lantern, soft as ash. But there was no softness in the room. Not in Marshall's stance. Not in Tommy's wide eyes. Not in the cries Ruthie let out from her bundle of blankets. Her tiny hands writhing in the cold. Tommy didn't ask what had just happened. He didn't have to. He had seen enough of the world to understand the characteristics of individuals who came to take and never give. Still, when he stepped forward, cradling Ruthie close, there was something different in the way he moved, slower, less frantic. For the first time, he knew someone had stood between them and danger, not with empty words, not with promises, but with lead and steel. Marshall made a U-turn to face him. He advised, get her close to the fire. Retain her. Warm. I'll fix the door. Tommy obeyed and Marshall set to work. His hands were steady, deliberate. He put the broken frame back together and hammered fresh nails into the icy wood. It bit into his fingers. It was a vow with each strike. They won't come through this way again. He barricaded the bottom, braced the latch with iron, reinforced the hinges. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was, but it would hold. Inside, Ruthie quieted, lulled by the heat and the sound of hammering. Half asleep, Tommy curled around her, but alert, watching Marshall with the reverence of a boy watching someone become more than just a man, someone becoming a haven of safety. Marshall didn't speak much that night. When he finally, in spite of the cold, he sat down, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat in the shadows. His brow was covered in sweat. His rifle leaned against the wall in front of him. He didn't relax, didn't close his eyes, just stared into the fire until dawn. Morning came dull and gray. No sun, just a pale sky pressing down on the earth like a second ceiling. The trees grown with ice. The trail down the ridge was buried deep in snow, and still Marshall moved with purpose. He stoked the fire, fried what was left of the salt pork, and passed half the plate to Tommy without a word. The boy didn't ask questions. He'd learned already that when the morning felt like a breath held too long, words could wait. Ruthie, though, let out a soft coo from her place beside the hearth. Her eyes blinked open, brighter than they'd been in days. Tommy gave a genuine, not half smile for the first time. Marshall saw it, and something in him shifted. After breakfast, Marshall pulled a ledger from beneath the floorboards. It was old, leather-bound pages wrinkled from years of damp and dust. Inside were names, most scratched, out dates, costs, and lists of long-standing unpaid debts. Tommy peered over his shoulder. What's that? Records? Marshall said from when this place was a working ranch. Was it yours? Marshall shook his head. My brother S.He died and trusted it to me. Tommy was hesitant. You don't have a family. Marshall's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed he wouldn't answer. Then use tool. That was all he said. But the way he closed the book set it gently back. Beneath the floor said more than words ever could. Later that day, they worked together. Tommy shoveled paths through the snow, small arms struggling but determined. Marshall chopped wood. The axe seemed to know where to fall when it split the log so quickly and cleanly. When the sun dipped low again, they returned, inside with numb fingers and red cheeks. Over dinner? Tommy posed the question. Think they'll come back? Marshall nodded once. They always do. Then, while we do, Marshall looked at him hard. Whatever we have to. Tommy didn't answer, but he held his spoon tighter, jaw clenched like a boy trying to swallow more than soup. The next morning, the mail came, just tossed at the trail's end, not delivered, soaked in snow and dirt. Marshall found it when he went to check the traps. A damaged envelope with 3 folds and creases at the corners contained a single page to Mr. Rigg. The Council of Grayson has decided that your recent behavior constitutes a breach of the social contract. You have no legal guardianship over the children in your care. Return them to the town by week's end. Failure to compliance will bring about legal action. Sincerely, Council Secretary, Office of Civil. Order. Marshall read it twice, then folded it again and placed it in his coat. When he returned to the cabin, he didn't mention it. Tommy noticed anyway. You're quiet, he said. Marshall said, I'm thinking in response. About us? Marshall nodded. Are we going to send us back? Marshall turned his head and saw, hard as granite, softened just slightly. No, he said. I'm going to town. He rode alone that evening, left Tommy with a rifle, a pot of stew, and instructions not to open the door for anyone who didn't call his name. The boy nodded, clutching Ruthie and the weapon like lifelines. Marshall saddled his mule and rode down the ridge with the wind at his back and fury in his gut. He didn't stop at the sheriff's office. He went straight to the chapel. Pastor Ward was locking up when he arrived. The man was old, thin, with eyes like polished glass and hands that trembled more now than they used to. He expressed surprise to Marshall. Been a while. I need a witness, Marshall replied. The pastor didn't ask why. The chapel has just been opened, doors, and led him to the front pew. There, by candlelight, Marshall took out the letter, placed it on the altar, and said quietly, I want to make it legal. Pastor Ward looked away. You mean adoption? Marshall nodded. If that's what it takes, I'm not giving them back. Ward studied him. You know this won't stop them. I know, Marshall said, but it'll slow them, and it'll show that someone's willing to stand up. The pastor sighed. The boy is not yours. He is now. And the girl, Marshall's voice faltered just once. She makes me think of someone. The pastor understood. He gave a slow nod, reached into a drawer, and pulled out a marriage register already yellow with age. On the back were blank forms for guardianship intended for orphans placed by the church. Marshall's dictation helped him complete it to the best of his ability. Tommy's full name, Ruthie, ages, circumstances. He paused at the line for relation to guardian. Marshall said, put by the grace of God. He returned to the cabin well past midnight. Tommy was awake, with his gun in hand, eyes fierce but steady. When he saw Marshall, he sagged with relief. You're back. Told you I would be. Did you stop them? Marshall nodded for now. He did not present the paper to them. Did not have to. Instead, he walked over to the hearth, poured himself a mug of tea, and sat in front of the cradle. Ruthie stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft sigh. Marshall watched her a long while. He stated, she's stronger than she looks. Tommy nodded. She always has been. There was pride in his voice now. Not worry, not fear, but only pride. Marshall leaned back, his body aching from the ride, his heart sore from old wounds reopening. But he didn't mind. Not tonight, because tonight there were 3 of them under that roof. And it wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a home, but peace is a fragile thing. 2 days later, the sheriff came. He wasn't by himself. Cord rode beside him, eyes gleaming. Behind them were 4 more men, all armed. They didn't knock, just dismounted and formed a line out front. Marshall saw them from the window. He turned to Tommy. Take her into the root cellar. Tommy shook his head, but now the boy obeyed, clutching Ruthie tight, vanishing down the narrow trap door beneath the kitchen. Marshall waited until he heard the hatch close. Then he stepped outside, Rifle across his back, the sheriff raised a hand. "We're here by council order. You've got no claim," Marshall remarked. "We've got a judge's stamp." Cord sneered. "Also a warrant." "Judge ain't here." "But we are." Marshall's jaw flexed. "Do you intend to shoot me in front of a child?" "Don't have to," the sheriff said. "Just need you to hand them." "Over." "No." Cord smirked. "Didn't think you would." He stepped forward. That's when the shot rang out, not from Marshall's rifle, from behind the cabin. A single warning shot fired into the air. The men scattered. Frightened, they reached for their weapons. But no second shot came, merely silence. Then a voice. I wouldn't try it again. From the tree end emerged a man, gray. Beard, long coat, rifle slung low and easy. There were 3 more neighbors behind him. Homesteaders, folks who rarely spoke but always watched. One of them pointed to Marshall with his hat. "Heard there was problem," he stated. Marshall gave a deliberate, slow nod without smiling. "You heard right." Cord cursed under his breath. The sheriff looked around, saw the peculiar shift, and he murmured, "Let's go." The riders turned left again. This time, there are no threats, only dust. After they vanished, Marshall remained still for some time, only when the trees were quiet. He opened the cellar once more. Tommy peered out with wide eyes. "Is it finished?" He was lifted up by Marshall, who reached down. "For now," he said, "but we're not alone. Any more." Snow piled thick against the windows, a slow and steady siege that crept higher, by the hour, muffling the world outside. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled warm and strong, casting a golden halo over everything it touched. Eyes that are worn out, soft hands, with blankets and with grain. Ruthie slept in the cradle, breathing steady now, her cheeks pink from health and not fever. Tommy sat beside her, with a whittle-lead bird in his palm, tracing the grooves Marshall had carved into its wings. He hadn't spoken much since the sheriff left. Neither had Marshall. Words they both come to understand didn't fix the kind of problems that rode up with guns and warrants, but they did hold weight when used right. Therefore, they used them sparingly, with caution, a nod here, a question there, a truth given only when it was ready to be heard. The morning after the standoff, Marshall made pancakes. Not because there was much to celebrate. Flour was low, the eggs thin, but because sometimes a warm meal could do more than just to talk. Tommy's eyes widened when the plate hit the table. 3 golden discs stacked high, steam rising, like a blessing. Marshall poured syrup from a bottle that hadn't been touched in months. There were no words, just a clink of forks, and the soft sigh of comfort returned. After breakfast, Marshall pulled Tommy's coat and handed it to him from the peg. "Bundle up," he said. "We were hired." Tommy stiffened. More snow. Always. He did not ask for more. He simply complied, pulling on the coat, wrapping a scarf around his neck, and following Marshall out into the cold. They cleared paths between the cabin and the barn, ice crunching beneath their boots. Marshall taught Tommy how to read the snow by how it settled, how to test the drift with his boot before stepping in, how to listen for the creak that warned of a roof about to give. 2 hens were stiff and frozen when they got to the chicken cage. Tommy's face fell. "Didn't hear them," he muttered. "Storms take the quiet ones first," Marshall said. "Doesn't mean you weren't listening." Although it did not lessen the sting, Tommy nodded. They buried the birds in hay, moving on to the trough from a shallow grave beneath a pine. Ice had sealed it thick. Tommy swung the hatchet with all he had, but it only chipped at the edges. Marshall stepped in, guiding the boy's grip, teaching him where to strike. "Like this," he said. "Don't fight it. Just follow the grain." The ice cracked on the 5th swing. Tommy grinned. By the time they returned to the cabin, their faces were red with cold and sweat, their hands sore but alive. Ruthie was up, gurgling in her cradle. Tommy ran to her, pressing his face against hers, murmuring nonsense that made her laugh. Marshall watched them from the doorway, his expression unreadable. There was a profound stirring in his chest, something he hadn't felt since before the grave was dug for his own daughter. Not joy right now, but the whisper of its shadow, the ache of possibility. The next letter came wrapped in red wax. Delivered by hand, again left at the trailhead. Marshall read it at the table, Tommy watching with the sharp eyes of a child who knew the weight of paper. Mr. Rig, you have ignored. Preceding orders of children are now classified as wards of the county. You are hereby summoned to a hearing to determine legal custody. Date January 18th. Location Grayson Courthouse. If you don't show up, it will be seen as an admission of guilt. Signed, Counsel, Secretary. Marshall stood after folding the letter and inserting it into the ledger. What's it mean? Tommy inquired. Marshall answered without looking up. Means they're gonna try. Again. You gonna let them? Marshall looked at him then. No, son, I'm not. The days turned colder. Snow stacked higher, but life didn't stop. Marshall and Tommy built a smokehouse from scrap behind the barn, hung venison to cure. They fixed a coop, buried a timber salvage that had been used to reinforce the storm shutters and a fence post that had snapped clean during the freeze. Fallen birch. Tommy learned to whittle better, his hands no longer clumsy. Marshall carved him a pocket knife from steel and taught him how to sharpen the blade without dulling the edge. At night, by the fire, they sat. Marshall would read from the good book when Tommy's eyes grew tired, his voice steady and deep. He read at night, "Let not your heart be troubled. You have faith in God. Believe also in me." With his hand on Ruthie's, as she fell asleep, Tommy listened intently. You think he really watches us? Rocking her gently in the cradle with one foot while stirring a pot of stew with his hand. He hummed without, realizing a steady, low melody with no real beginning but only comfort stitched into sound. Until the knock, he didn't hear the writers. Not a sharp rap, just 3 knuckles on wood, precise, calm. The door was opened by Marshall himself. The man in front was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over pale eyes. His coat was black, heavy, lined with fur at the collar. The horse beneath him was jet black and foamless, like they hadn't ridden hard to get here. He did not smile or give his name, just tilted his head toward the cabin and said, "You Marshall Rigg?" "I am. We come on contract," the man said, voice flat. "Name of court, Alton says. There's a pair of runaways here, a boy and a girl. Assertions that you are protecting them from the town. Say I've got guardianship," Marshall replied. "Signed by the church, recognized by the sheriff." The man dismounted slowly. He wasn't hurried. The kind of slow that meant confidence, not hesitation. Behind him, the other 2 stayed in their saddles, hands near their belts. One had a beard like a briar patch and fingers that snapped. The other man smiled like a man watching pigs march to slaughter as he chewed on a stick of licorice. "We're not here to question your papers," the lead said. "We're here to collect." "On what?" "Justice," he said, and finally smiled. "Town has decided that it wants the girl back. Said she's too young to be in the hands of a man who ain't got blood ties." Marshall did not move a muscle. "They make that decision before or after they sent me that letter saying custody was mine." The man nodded. "Doesn't matter to us. We don't care about policies. We deal in people. And the bounty's already posted." Behind the man, Tommy had stepped into the doorway, Ruthie in his arms. He didn't speak, but his eyes locked on the stranger's. Ruthie whimpered softly, sensing the tension. Tommy rocked her gently, but the way his knuckles whitened around her told Marshall everything. Marshall took 1 step forward. "You come 1 more inch toward this house, and I'll bury you before the frost lifts." The man's smile faded. "You threatening. Bounty men with a witness in tow." Marshall stated, "I'm offering you mercy. Take it." The bearded man on the left spat into the snow. The one containing licorice laughed. "He thinks we care," he said. However, the leader has just examined Marshall. A long, silent gaze after that. he retreated slowly. He stated that not today, but the town's paid for us to get that girl. They'll pay double if we bring her back by month's end. You best decide whether you're willing to give your life for a child who is not yours. Marshall didn't move. She is mine. The man smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and the three rode off, vanishing between the pines like smoke. That night the cabin stayed, quiet long past supper. Tommy hadn't spoken since the men left. He sat curled in the corner, Ruthie bundled in a quilt, her tiny hand clinging to the edge of his shirt. Marshall watched him, carving a new piece of wood, this time a horse with deliberate, smooth edges. Finally, Tommy looked up. They will return. Yes, they'll try to take her. Yes, and they might hurt you. Marshall didn't answer. Not right away. He set the carving aside, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. There are some fights worth losing, he said. However, there aren't many things to avoid. Tommy looked up. Glisten, I'm not scared for me. I know. They sat in silence again, saved for the crackle of the fire and the soft wheeze of Ruthie's breath. When Marshall finally stood, he pulled down the rifle, laid it on the table, and began cleaning it after removing it from the mantel. Tommy watched, then asked quietly, Can you teach me? Marshall didn't look up. Not today. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. The next day, Marshall rode into town. Again, not to assist, not for answers, for supplies. He bought nails, timber, ammunition, salt, medicine, a second rifle. People stared. No one spoke. The word had spread. Grayson knew what was coming. Knew Marshall Rigg was digging in. Some folks approved. Others shook their heads. But no one tried to stop him. Not after last time. At the general store, the clerk rang up the purchases with shaking hands. You think you can hold out? Marshall didn't answer. You think they'll stop? Still silent. The clerk finally asked, Is it worth it? Marshall met his eyes. Was your child worth it? The clerk swallowed hard and looked away. Marshall loaded the wagon himself. Back at the cabin, preparations began. He reinforced the windows, nailed iron, braces to the door frame, dug trenches around the perimeter where snow wouldn't feel easy, giving him a clear path to. If he had to move, he built a second wall behind the front door, narrow and angled so that breaking through would be more difficult for anyone. Tommy assisted. He held the nails, measured the beams, and gave tools away without asking. Each night they trained. Marshall set up targets behind the barn, taught Tommy to aim, to breathe, to squeeze, not pull. Tommy's hand shook at first, but they got steadier with each shot. He never fired with Ruthie. Nearby, only when she was asleep, only when the wind was low. She has had a birthday? Marshall asked once. Tommy blinked. I don't think so. Pick a day, Marshall remarked. We'll make one. Tommy deliberated. February 1st. All right, Marshall said. That will be all. They didn't mention it again. But when the snow cleared that morning, Marshall gave Ruthie a carved rattle made from maple-painted soft yellow. Tommy baked a lopsided cake from flour, dried apples, and molasses. Ruthie smashed it with her hands and squealed. It was the first time she laughed loud enough to echo. Marshall nearly smiled. But the days ticked down, each one a little quieter, each one sharpening the edge. Then the 29th came, 3 weeks since. The first warning. The storm came first. Winds howled through the valley. Snow slammed against the windows hard enough to rattle glass. The sky turned slate gray, the kind of color that didn't just warn of danger, it promised it. Marshall didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with his rifle across his lap, boots planted firm. Tommy was resting next to Ruthie in a cot, his hand resting on her back, feeling her chest rise and fall. Then the sound came, not thunder, hooves, dozens. This time, not 3 men. More. Marshall stood. He walked a window. Lanterns made its way through the trees. light that moved like pinpricks between the shadows. Snow obstructed their approach, but the shape was visible. Riders, at least 10, maybe more. Marshall didn't speak. He turned to Tommy, kneeling. "You know what to do." Tommy nodded. "Root cellar. Stay hidden. Don't come out, unless you call." "That's right." The boy received a hand from Marshall on the shoulder. "Whatever happens, you keep her safe. That's the only thing that matters." Tommy's lip trembled. "But you're not concerned about me." Ruthie stirred, her eyes blinking open. Marshall kissed her forehead once, quick and sure, then rose. He opened the door to the trap. Tommy climbed in, holding Ruthie close. Marshall passed down a blanket, a lamp, and the Bible. Then he shut the hatch and secured it outside. The snow kept falling. The riders came to a 20-yard stop. From the cabin, the lead stepped forward. Same black coat, same pale eyes. "You had your time," he called. "This is the end of it." Marshall didn't answer. He just cocked the rifle. The man smiled, and then the night erupted. Gunfire cracked the silence. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls, splintering wood. Marshall returned. Fire, sharp and deliberate. Each shot landed sufficiently close to the front line to disperse it. He moved fast, window to wall, ducking, reloading. Outside, the riders fanned out. 2, circling back. Marshall heard it, turned, shot through the rear shutter, sending one man down. The other fell seconds later, his rifle clattering into snow. Inside the cellar, Tommy flinched at the noise. Ruthie cried, and he held her tight, whispering promises into her ear. "He's okay," he said. "He always returns." Upstairs, Marshall reloaded again, breath heavy. Then silence. No more shots. No hooves. Nothing. He waited. Long seconds. Then a voice. "Enough." The leader called. "You're outnumbered. Outgunned. Do not create this." Worse. Marshall made his way through the doorway. He was surrounded by snow. "I told you," he said. "She's mine." And then a gunshot cracked. Not from the front, from behind. Inside, a traitor. They had let one of them in. Through the storm door. Marshall turned too late. The bullet struck his shoulder. He stumbled, firing once before collapsing against the frame. The room swayed. Blood seeped through his coat. He was being surrounded by footsteps. Below, Tommy heard the shot, froze, then moved. Vast. He made the hatch open, climbed out, armed with a rifle. Smoke filled the room. He saw Marshall on the floor, the man standing over him. Gun raised. Tommy didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot cracked like judgment. The man dropped, dead. Tommy ran to Marshall. Blood soaked the floor. "Don't die," he whispered. "Please." Marshall blinked up at him. "I told you. Don't come out." "I had to." More shots outside. Marshall grabbed Tommy's hand. "Get back down there. I'm not leaving you." "You're not," Marshall whispered. And then the door exploded inward. The door shattered, as if it had always been waiting for that moment. Splinters shooting across the room, the wind roaring in. Behind it, like an angry beast. Tommy was thrown back against a hearthstone by the blast, his ribs striking with a piercing thud that took his breath away. For a moment, the cabin blurred, firelight stuttering against snow and smoke. Everything is whirling. Then shapes appeared in the haze. Boots, coats, guns, flooding through the wreckage like a black tide with no mercy in its eyes. Marshall was still down. His body lay, half curled near the center of the room, blood soaking the wood beneath him. One hand clutching the rifle stock, though. He no longer had the strength to lift it. Tommy saw him stir, just barely, and that was enough to make the boy move. Not to safety, not away. Toward him. He crawled on hands and knees across the ruined floor, staying low as more gunfire broke out. One round of sound echoed throughout the cabin, fracturing the mantel, and yet another burying itself in the table's leg. Ruthie's cries screamed up from the cellar below, frantic and shrill. However, The trap door did not open. Somehow, Tommy didn't dare look back. Two men entered first, one crouched with a revolver, the other sweeping the room with a long-barreled shotgun. Their boots crunched on broken glass and ash. They moved with confidence like men who'd been here before, like men who'd finished worse jobs. Then they saw the boy. Tommy had reached Marshall by then. The man's eyes were half-lit, his breath shallow and ragged, but his hand still tightened when the boy touched his arm. "Gun," Marshall rasped. "I've got it." Tommy reached beneath the cot and pulled the second rifle, loaded, primed, waiting. He was unsure whether he could fire it again. His hands had shaking. His shoulder throbbed from where it struck the stone, but he crouched beside Marshall and leveled the barrel, as Marshall had instructed him to do. Elbows tight, eyes steady, breathing slow. The shotgun man raised his weapon. Tommy was the one who fired. The shot was deafening. The recoil slammed into his shoulder as if punching. The man dropped instantly, chest blooming red, body hitting the wall so hard that he broke the coat rack behind him. The second man dived into cover and fired. Wildly, a bullet tore through the edge of the cradle. Another struck the landing above, sending it crashing to the floor in a storm of fire and oil. The room lit up with flame. Marshall groaned, twisting away as the fire spread across the old rug. Smoke poured upward, choking the air, turning the room into a hellish blur of orange and black. Tommy coughed, eyes watering, but he stood. He did not flee. He fired again, this time blind, and the second man screamed, a short, sharp sound that ended with a crash as he fell through the table. Silence followed, except for the fire, other than Ruthie. Tommy dropped the rifle and lunged to the trap door, yanking it open. Smoke belched downward, filling the cellar. He reached in, arms shaking. She was tiny, covered in sweat, and her crying had turned her face red. He held her tightly against his chest as he pulled her up. Then he turned back to Marshall. He shouted, "We have to leave." Marshall blinked slowly, head rolling toward the sound. "I call. You have to." "I can't feel my legs," Marshall whispered. Tommy's heart twisted. He looked at the flames are already licking the cabinets and climbing the walls. Then he looked at the man on the floor. He made his choice. Setting Ruthie gently on the quilt, he grabbed Marshall beneath the arms and pulled. The man was much heavier than Tommy had anticipated, but he dug, his heels into the floor, muscles burning, and dragged him backward inch by inch. Almost there, he gasped. Smoke curled into his lungs. The heat seared his skin. Ruthie had been coughing. Now, the roar of the fire got louder. He made it to the door, or at least what was left of it. The frame remained in place. Snow fell silently and softly beyond it, as if mocking. The chaos inside, just as a portion of the ceiling gave way behind them, Tommy pulled Marshall through the threshold, showering the hearth in flame and debris. They gave up and fell to the snow. Ruthie wailed. She was scooped up into Tommy's arms as he climbed to her and wept, with soot and ash on his cheeks. The cabin burned behind them, a pillar of the night sky is illuminated by fire. With his eyes shut, Marshall was still beside them, blood still seeping from his shoulder. Tommy pressed a hand to the wound, panicking. "No, no, no. Stay with me." Marshall's eyes twitched. "I'm here. You're losing too much." Tommy sobbed. "You're not going to make it. I require Doc Halen. He's in town. We can't." Marshall's fingers gripped Tommy's wrist weakly. "You're stronger than you think. I can't do this alone." "You're not alone." And then he passed out. It was 4 miles to Grayson. Tommy wrapped Ruthie against his chest, with the quilt, and tied Marshall's arms around the mule's neck with broken res. He had to lift the man onto the beast himself, gritting his teeth against the strain. It took 3 tries and half his strength. The mule resisted, but it did not flee. Then they walked through snow, through wind, through pain. Tommy didn't stop once. He reached Grayson near dawn. The town was silent, doors shuttered, windows dark. Tommy stumbled his way into the square, his voice as he yelled for help At first, no one answered. Then a light flicked on. Another. The door then opened. It was Pastor Ward. He saw the blood, the child, the look in the boy's eyes. He posed no questions. He called the doctor in. Marshall was taken to the parsonage and laid on a table. Doc Halen worked for hours, his face drawn, his hands fast. Tommy didn't leave the room. He sat with Ruthie in the corner, rocking her, whispering the same sentence over and over like a prayer. He has to make it. The town had gathered outside. Whispers filled the street. Rumors, guilt. By noon, the sheriff arrived. Then Cord. He walked with A, now limp, a present for his previous visit to the cabin, and heavily seated on a cane. When he saw Tommy, he sneered. You'll come clean about what you did. Tommy got up, clutching Ruthie. He was protecting us. You're a child. You don't know. He saved us, Tommy snapped. I would also do it again. Cord stepped forward. Pastor Ward then stepped between them. That's enough, the old man said. You want a trial, you get a judge. You want justice, you listen to the truth. The cord snapped. You think the council will let this slide? I think, the pastor said, they'll do what they're told for once. Behind, the door creaked behind them. Marshall's weak but firm voice came through. He's my son. They turned. Marshall stood in the doorway, pale, bloodstained, propped up by Doc Halen. But his eyes were clear. His voice was steady. You want to take him, he said. You'll go through me again. Cord stared, and then he stepped back. You'll regret this, he said. No, Marshall replied. You will. The sheriff filed the paperwork that afternoon. The council tried to protest, but the town had changed. They'd seen what it looked like when a man stood up, when a boy refused to back down, when a fire didn't burn everything, it forged something stronger. By the next week, the cabin had burned to ash, but the neighbors arrived with hands, nails, and lumber. They built again together. Marshall oversaw the work from a chair near the slope, shoulder bandaged, Ruthie on his lap. Tommy hammered beams and laid the foundation. The new cabin was stronger, wider, warmer. Marshall observed Tommy gazing up at the sky one night. What are your thoughts? He asked. Tommy looked up. How close we came to losing everything. He was sat beside Marshall. But we didn't. No, Tommy said, we didn't. From the porch behind them, Ruthie cried. Tommy smiled. She's ours now, right? Marshall nodded. She was always. The snow thawed early that spring. Birds came back. Through the charred, the grass turned green. Soil. And 3 souls who'd once been lost found something they never expected. A future that is neither given nor borrowed, built together. After dinner that night, potatoes, beans, cornbread, and enough pie to leave the table sticky. Tommy sat by the fireplace. Ruthie curled against his side. The room was filled with quiet voices, laughter, the rustle of children being tucked into bed. He reached beneath the floorboard and pulled out the ledger. He accessed the initial page. There were only 3 names there. Marshall, Tommy, Ruthie. Now, he turned the page and wrote, Leo Hargrove, Clara Hargrove. He didn't know how long they'd stay. Didn't care. The fact that they were no longer alone was what mattered. The seasons changed once more. Years passed. The property grew. Tommy taught boys how to swing hammers, how to shoot straight, how to walk into a room without flinching. He taught girls how to saddle a horse, how to read, contracts, how to speak without apology. Ruthie was sharp and helped him run the place. As attacked by 15, wilder than any colt with Marshall's calm and Tommy's steel. They had taken in more than 40 children by the time she turned 18 years old. Some stayed, while others moved on, all remembered. They called it the Ridge. Some said it was a place for the broken. But those who'd been there knew better. It was where the broken healed, where the forgotten found names, where a man once stood between pain and innocence, and passed that torch to a boy who'd been auctioned like property, but grew into a man who never kept score and gave away everything. On the 15th, anniversary of Marshall's death, the town held a gathering. Grayson was a change, too. There were new families, new buildings, but the heart of it, beaten, bruised, but still beating, had grown stronger. The mayor asked Tommy to speak. He stood before the crowd, Ruthie at his side, and said, "I once stole a loaf of bread to keep my sister alive. They chained me for it, tried to sell me like a mule. One man said no. One man opened his door." He paused, eyes sweeping the crowd. "You're not measured by what you own or how loud you shout. You are evaluated using who you protect and what you build for someone who is nothing." He stepped down, without applause, but there was silence, and then slowly every man removed his hat, and the bell tolled once. That evening Tommy rode to the hill alone. The oak had grown thicker. He knelt beside the marker, not to grieve, just to talk. He said that things are holding up. Soon, fences will need to be replaced. Ruthie advises planting barley next year. You'd have liked her plans. She's sharp. He paused and smiled. You were right. I wasn't alone. He stood, dusted off his coat. Thank you. As he walked down the ridge, the wind stirred the leaves. Not difficult, just enough, almost like a reply.